They say the richest people often live in the poorest hearts. For Ethan Caldwell, that couldn't have been more true, at least at the start of the story. Ethan wasn't just wealthy, he was iconic. A household name in boardrooms, fashion magazines, and the guest lists of the most elite galas across New York City. His empire was built on ruthless deals, a talent for charm, and a belief that money solved everything. But what he didn't know was that one of the most trivial bets of his life would become the most expensive lesson he'd ever learn, not in dollars, but in truth. The night it all began was like any other for him: shimmering lights, clinking glasses, egos, dressed in designer labels. At a fundraiser hosted in his own penthouse, complete with a crystal chandelier from Milan, Ethan was surrounded by luxury and attention. That's when Lucas Bennett, his best friend and the only person who dared to challenge him, dropped a bomb. "You say you can win over anyone." Lucas grinned, sipping whiskey with a tilt of mockery in his tone. "How about you get someone who doesn't give a damn about your money to marry you?" Ethan scoffed. "You mean like a nun?" "No," Lucas replied, "someone real. A woman who scrubs floors instead of catwalks. 3 months. If you fail, I get your Aston Martin. If you win, you get my shares in Bennett Hotels." A smirk curled at the edge of Ethan's mouth. "You're on." The next morning, as fate, or perhaps irony, would have it, Isabella Flores entered the Caldwell estate for her first day of work. She was hired as a housekeeper. She came from a modest immigrant family, spoke little, worked hard, and carried the kind of quiet dignity that wealth couldn't buy. She had no time for games and no reason to care who Ethan Caldwell was. That intrigued him. While other women competed for his attention, Isabella looked through him like glass. When he tried to charm her in the garden, she responded with blunt honesty: "It's just a job. Liking it isn't relevant." He wasn't offended. He was fascinated. A day later, he made her a proposition that would define them both. "Pretend to be my fiancé. Just for 3 months. I'll pay you enough to support your family for years." She didn't flinch. She asked, "One thing I won't fake love. I won't be your puppet." "Deal," he said. He didn't know that was the last deal he'd ever make that wouldn't come back to haunt him. At first, everything went according to plan. They attended charity galas, rubbed shoulders with senators and superstars, and the tabloids buzzed about the mysterious woman who'd tamed Ethan Caldwell. But while the world saw glitz inside, Ethan was beginning to see himself in a mirror for the first time. Isabella didn't just follow him into his world, she held it up for inspection. At one auction, he dropped $300,000 on an abstract painting. On the way out, Isabella remarked, "You could feed a whole block of hungry families with that." He laughed off the comment at first. Then something in her tone, genuine, unpretentious, stuck. For once, he didn't feel pride. He felt embarrassment. And it didn't stop there. She called out how he ignored his staff. She volunteered on weekends while he slept in silk sheets. She didn't need to try to impress him, she challenged him to impress himself. And little by little he did. One night while they sat on his penthouse balcony staring out at the skyline, Ethan asked her a simple question: "What will you do when this ends?" She replied, "Go back to my life, the one you never saw value in." That night, something in Ethan broke, and something else began to grow in its place. But fate doesn't just offer redemption, it tests it. While Ethan was away at a business conference, Lucas, perhaps out of envy or guilt, approached Isabella with a grin that masked a dagger. "You know why Ethan picked you," he said, swirling his wine. "You were a bet, a challenge, nothing more." Her face fell. When Ethan returned, she was gone. Her room empty, the silence louder than any storm. He found her packing. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just asked, "Who do you think I am?" Ethan couldn't answer, because he hadn't known until it was too late. Isabella walked out, and with her walked out the one thing he could never buy back: trust. Ethan had everything except her, and for the first time in his life, none of it mattered. The silence in his mansion wasn't peaceful, it was punishing. Every inch of opulence reminded him of what he had lost. The velvet armchairs, the imported marble floor, the paintings she once questioned. They were all there, mocking him. He tried to reach out, but Isabella didn't answer. She didn't yell or retaliate. She vanished. Her absence wasn't dramatic. It was surgical, and it left him bleeding. Lucas later tried to play it off with a smug shrug. "You forgot it was a game," he said. But Ethan no longer cared about winning. He had crossed the line between games and life without even realizing it. At first he sank, drowning in guilt, in regret, in memories. Then something unexpected happened. He didn't try to replace her. He didn't run to the next model, the next high-stakes merger, the next private jet party. Instead, he disappeared too, but not out of avoidance, out of a need to start over. He returned to the homeless shelter where Isabella used to volunteer. Not as a show, not for PR, just to understand. And it was there, serving food alongside volunteers who didn't know or care that he was Ethan Caldwell, that he began to change. He rolled up his sleeves, he washed dishes, he listened, and slowly the man who once believed the world revolved around him began to revolve around something else: purpose. You might think this is where the redemption arc reaches its peak, that she forgives him and they fall back into each other's arms. But real life doesn't hand out happy endings that easily. Weeks passed. Ethan changed his habits, sold off vanity investments, shut down a luxury club he'd never even visited, launched a scholarship in Isabella's mother's name. But he never used her name in interviews, not once, because he didn't want the credit, he wanted the consequence. He found her eventually in Brooklyn, working at a small cafe that served strong coffee and stronger women. When their eyes met, her expression was unreadable. But her guard, it was up. "I'm not here for coffee," Ethan said gently, placing a bill on the counter. "I'm here to apologize." "Do you think that's enough?" she asked. "No," he replied, "but it's where I need to start." She didn't soften, not right away. Wounds that deep don't close with words. Still he left. No pressure, no plea. But he didn't stop showing up in the places that mattered. Community centers, food drives, low-income schools. Not for her to see him, but because she had shown him how blind he'd been. And in those moments, slowly Isabella began to see the truth, not in headlines or gestures, but in his silence, his consistency. One day while visiting the shelter, she found him fixing a child's broken bike. His expensive watch was gone, his hair slightly disheveled, but his smile authentic. That child had once lived on the streets. Now he had volunteers like Ethan helping him feel visible again. That night, Isabella sat by her window, clutching a cup of chamomile tea, thinking of all the ways people pretend to change, and all the ways Ethan no longer had to. She didn't want to believe in him, but her heart was no longer listening to her logic. And then it happened. One late afternoon, as she stepped out of work there, he stood. No suits, no bodyguards, just sunflowers, her favorite, and a quiet kind of hope in his eyes. "I promised I wouldn't show up unless you were ready," he said. "And if you tell me to leave, I will." She looked at the bouquet, then at the man, then at the space between them, once filled with betrayal, now filled with growth. "You've really changed," she whispered, and he smiled, not arrogantly, but vulnerably, as he knelt down, pulled out a ring that was simple and honest, and said words that made the entire world melt around them. "You were never a bet. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. I can't undo the past. But if you let me, I'll spend the rest of my life earning your trust and loving you the way you deserve." Tears slipped down her cheeks because she didn't need a mansion or a contract or a grand gesture. She just needed to believe him. And in that moment, she did. They didn't return to the lavish world that wants to find Ethan. They stepped forward into a different one built not on marble and crystal, but on forgiveness, intention, and small acts of love that spoke louder than any grand display ever could. Their wedding didn't happen in a five-star venue. It was held in the garden of the Caldwell estate, not because it was opulent, but because it had seen the worst and best of them. The soil there had held their silence, their misunderstandings, and finally their reconciliation. It wasn't a guest list filled with billionaires or movie stars. Standing there that day were the people who mattered most, the volunteers from the community shelter, the staff who once felt invisible in Ethan's presence, the child whose bicycle he repaired, and Isabella's family no longer struggling, no longer ashamed. Her mother cried not from worry this time, but from pride. And when Ethan took Isabella's hand and looked into her eyes, he didn't promise perfection. He promised presence. "I will make mistakes," he said quietly, "but I will never make you feel like one of them." She smiled through her tears and whispered, "That's all I ever wanted." There were no fireworks, no viral videos, no trending hashtags, just two people standing side by side deciding to build something real on the ashes of what had once been fake. And maybe that's what love is not about: sweeping gestures or perfect timing, but about seeing someone completely and still choosing to stay. For those watching this story, you might be wondering how something that started with a lie could end with something so true. That's the paradox of life. Sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most necessary transformations. What started as a bet turned into a brutal mirror. Ethan saw who he had become, a man obsessed with winning, admired but empty. And through Isabella, he saw who he could become: a man who didn't just give, but gave a damn. Now let's pause the narrative and think about what this really teaches us. In real life, we often put people in boxes, label them by their background, their job, or their financial status. Ethan believed Isabella was just a maid. He forgot that behind every uniform is a heartbeat, a story, a strength, and Isabella. She knew her worth long before anyone else did. She didn't let love override her dignity. She didn't collapse under wealth or charm. She drew her boundaries and waited not for a prince, but for a man to grow up and stand beside her as an equal. There's a real-world truth here, especially for relationships today, romantic or otherwise. Trust isn't built by words, it's built by patterns, consistency, change that doesn't need an audience to be real. Think of the people you admire not because they talk about change, but because they live it, like the teacher who buys food for her students with her own salary, the man who picks up litter on his walk to work, the teenager who stands up for a bullied classmate when no one's watching. True transformation doesn't need a spotlight, it needs a reason. For Ethan, that reason was Isabella. And for Isabella, the lesson wasn't just about learning to forgive. It was about learning to allow someone back in only after they'd earned the space again. Months after their wedding, Ethan still volunteered at the shelter every Friday. Not out of guilt, but because he genuinely cared. He didn't just sign checks anymore. He showed up. He asked how people were doing and listened. He also started a foundation not in his name, but in honor of all the people he used to overlook. It focused on domestic workers, underpaid caregivers, and young adults aging out of foster care. He said it was the least he could do. And Isabella, she continued working at the cafe by choice, not because she had to, but because she loved the rhythm of it, the conversations, the people, the honesty of it all. She became a mentor to young women in similar circumstances, reminding them that dignity was never tied to dollar signs. They built their home not on wealth, but on stories of where they'd been and what they refused to become again. It wasn't perfect. There were arguments. There were days when Ethan still struggled to let go of old habits. But the difference now, he showed up. He apologized. He grew. And that made all the difference. Because in the end, what stunned Ethan on the wedding night wasn't a secret or a surprise. It was the quiet realization that he no longer needed to perform. He was loved not for the cars in his garage or the name on his bank account. He was loved because he had finally become someone worth loving. And so if you're watching this wondering if people can really change, the answer is yes. But only if they want to. Only if they face themselves. Only if they're willing to lose the game to win something greater: connection, purpose, and the rarest kind of love, the kind that makes you better, not just happier. Let this story be a reminder that what begins in deception doesn't have to end in it. It can, if you're brave, end in something true. Subscribe our channel for more powerful stories about love, self-growth, and human connection, and turn on the bell so you don't miss the next emotional journey. Thank you for watching.